This week's lecture on Howard Zinn is essentially a continuation of our discussion last week when we were getting into this response to consensus history, and that response being, of course, radical history. But at the same time, as I've been repeating throughout the lectures in this course, this is also part of that long-standing conversation, because in this lecture on Howard Zinn, we are going to continue to see things like objectivity come up, scientism come up in terms of what sort of history is best and which sort of history provides the truest sense of what really went on in the past. So one of the things I do want to highlight before actually getting right into this lecture is the fact that even though I classify Howard Zinn as a radical historian, he was a little bit separated from the group that we talked about last week, the radical historians that were involved, for instance, in some of the events that took place in the American Historical Association meeting in 1969. And the reason was, for a very simple fact, Howard Zinn was older than most of the individuals who were involved in some of that early radical history of the 1960s. But nonetheless, like I said, for our purposes here, he is definitely a part of this school. So I would consider this, and I want you to do so, as sort of a case study, honing in on one figure who is really significant in helping radical history sort of move beyond the ivory walls of academia and the universities into the general public. I'd like to begin this lecture by talking a little bit about the education of Howard Zinn, basically his backstory. And we're going to begin this backstory in 1943, because it was in that year that Howard Zinn enlisted in the Air Force, fervently believing that the war, World War II, had a noble cause, meaning the destruction of fascism. Now, this may seem an unlikely occurrence for someone who will later, in the 1960s and 1970s, eventually criticize U.S. foreign policy, but nonetheless, here early in his life in 1943, Howard Zinn definitely believed in what the United States was fighting for. So while in the service, after basic training, he would eventually fly on the B-17s that were involved in the carpet bombing of German cities during World War II. When the war ended and he eventually returned home, Zinn decided that he was going to enroll at the university. And at the age of 27, he did so when he joined Washington Square College, which would become eventually known, as it still is today, New York University. With a family to feed, Zinn would also work various odd jobs, so it took him about 6 years to graduate with his undergraduate degree from Washington Square College / New York University. Well, Howard Zinn decided that he enjoyed academia. He enjoyed the atmosphere and the environment and thinking about these topics and subjects. So therefore, he would eventually enter graduate school at Columbia University, also in New York. And while there, he would eventually write a master's thesis in just 1 year. Usually the master's thesis takes 2 years, but he was very excited about his topic and he got it done in actually 1. And speaking of his topic, he actually chose the violent Ludlow strike of 1913-1914. Now you actually see this event discussed in one of the documents for this week. And as is said in that document, Zinn has said many times before and after that document was written that you're reading for this week that he first discovered the Ludlow Massacre, as it was known, when listening to Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie was a prominent folk singer. He was also a peace activist. But nonetheless, Woody Guthrie had recorded a song titled The Ludlow Massacre. So that is where Howard Zinn came up with his master's thesis topic, and that's what he researched. What we are going to see is Howard Zinn will continue on at Columbia and eventually earn his PhD. Now for his PhD, we would see Howard Zinn study a politician, which was sort of a far cry from the Ludlow Massacre that he studied for his master's degree, which sort of fits in with that idea of bottom-up history. But nonetheless, Fiorello LaGuardia makes sense as well, because LaGuardia was a member of the House of Representatives for New York, and he later served as mayor of New York City as well. Now, Fiorello LaGuardia appealed to Howard Zinn because this was a politician who really pursued progressive causes. He was a social justice fighter, trying to help the little man and woman, if you will, through labor legislation, social welfare policies, so on and so forth. And what we are going to see is after Howard Zinn earned his PhD, he would accept a position at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, if you know anything about Spelman College, one of the things that you probably hear is that it is in fact most well known, rightly so, for being one of the most prominent historically black private women's colleges. And we can see here this image on the right, Howard Zinn as a young, recent PhD earner here. He is on the left, bottom left of the screen. He's actually signing copies of one of his books here. This picture comes from 1960. And not surprisingly, while he was there, carrying out his teaching responsibilities, doing research for articles and books, he also became involved in civil rights activism. Most notably, he joined an organization known as SNCC, SNCC, which stood for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, his civil rights activism eventually would cause him many difficulties at Spelman College, and eventually lead to his dismissal in 1963. But due to the error that he came out of his PhD program, there were jobs aplenty. So after he was fired from Spelman College in 1963, he immediately found another job the following year in the political science department at Boston University. And it was there, even as he continued his activism, speaking out in favor of civil rights, anti-war politics, so on and so forth, he would remain at that university, Boston University, until his retirement in 1988. So in short, what we are seeing here is sort of a transformation that takes place over essentially 25 years, a quarter century. We began this story in 1943 when Howard Zinn very patriotically fights for his nation for the destruction of fascism. After his service in the military and the Air Force, he will enroll in college, earning his undergraduate degree, slowly but surely focusing in on the other half, the workers in the Ludlow Massacre, the progressive politicians. Eventually he gets a job, Spelman College, and we start to see this historian moving beyond the classroom and protesting out on the streets in favor of civil rights, and then eventually arriving in Boston University. On this slide, I describe Howard Zinn as the people's historian, and that obviously is a play on his most prominent publication, which was published some 45 years ago, nearly 44 years ago, A People's History of the United States, published in 1980. I want to actually begin this story by going back to the early 2010s, 2012 to be exact, because it was in 2012, 2 years after Howard Zinn's death in 2010, that the website History News Network, which was a program slash website that was organized and operated by George Washington University, they conducted a survey of more than 600 historians. And according to the results of this survey on History News Network, or HNN, what they found is that Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States was the second, quote, least credible book in print. The comments by participants in the vote included several criticisms of Zinn that help explain why it was listed as number 2 on, again, this idea of least credible book in print list. So one of those comments said the following. They criticized Zinn, particularly his, quote, viewing American history through a Marxist lens. Another commentator ridiculed the book as, quote, cheap propaganda. So not surprisingly, all of this talk about workers, laborers fighting for their rights, union rights in particular, led a lot of readers to view Howard Zinn as a Marxist. He was clearly talking about class struggle. That was his MO. That was his go-to move. Others, though, however, in the same comment section came to Zinn's defense. For instance, while a commentator agreed that Zinn deserved to be, quote, criticized for giving movements from below a heroic aura, and thus overstating their godlike qualities, if you will, this same commentator explained that, quote, this is not the same as a factual misrepresentation. So yes, there is definitely some bias in Howard Zinn's writings. Again, he sort of puts these grassroots activists, laborers, common, everyday, average, ordinary Americans on a pedestal, but nonetheless, he is not misrepresenting the truth. But nonetheless, such vitriol should not be surprising. And to really point this out, I want to make the argument that this was nothing new. This had been going on for essentially the last 30 years, particularly among professional historians, which was the target audience of the History News Network. That's who went to the History News Network website, historians. So we've seen this again since the beginning when this book was published, A People's History of the United States was published in 1980. For instance, we would see Oscar Handlin, who was a renowned historian during this period, describe the book as, quote, a deranged fairy tale, a deranged fairy tale. So very derogatory language used against this man Howard Zinn for his writings. But nonetheless, we are going to see that Howard Zinn's book remains popular among both students and the general public. Now, for instance, I want to start out with here the fact that in terms of sales, since its publication in 1980, so again, almost 45 years ago, more than 2 million copies have flown off the shelves. This is an astronomical figure, 2 million copies for a historical manuscript, a historical book, when most historical monographs sell, if the historian is lucky, a few hundred copies at most. So clearly, this was a very popular book, and it still is to this day, selling well over 2 million copies. And another interesting point that I want to highlight here is we also see that A People's History really entered the sphere of popular culture throughout the last quarter of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So first of all, this image that we see here on the left, I'm sure most of you can tell primarily because of the look of that character on the screen. This is from The Simpsons, and as you can see, this Simpsons character is reading The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So it's even entered the Simpsons universe. Also, if anyone has ever seen I believe it was in I don't think it ran into the early 2000s, I think it was primarily the 1990s, the HBO TV series The Sopranos. There's a scene in one episode of The Sopranos where AJ, who is the son of the main character, the mob boss Tony Soprano, AJ is reading this huge book, The People's History of the United States. And what happens during this scene is AJ talks about how the book describes Columbus as sort of genocidal, carrying out genocide of the Native Americans. And obviously, Tony Soprano and his family are Italian, so they were not happy about this. Eventually, what is going to happen in that scene, Tony Soprano will say to his son AJ, quote, "You finally read a book and it's bullshit." Angry, of course, again, that it accuses the Italian explorer, Christopher Columbus, of committing genocide. This doesn't happen often when you see a historian write a book and it appears on The Simpsons, one of the most popular animated series in history, The Sopranos, another extremely popular television series. This is different than what usually happens where a historian's book either stays in public, either runs out of its first run, doesn't sell any more copies, goes out of print, or it collects dust in a library shelf. That was not the case here with Howard Zinn's book. It clearly had influence. So despite, and here's the point I'm making, despite all the criticism from these professional historians, there is something to say that A People's History is a significant part of history and historiography, particularly from the public perspective, the popular history perspective. What I'd like to do now is to delve a little into the sort of history that Howard Zinn produces in The People's History and also his books more generally. And clearly what we are seeing is another example again of this idea of history from the bottom up. So Zinn's book caught the public's attention because it did something that no other textbook or general history book read widely by the public had done before. And by that I mean Howard Zinn's A People's History brought this new social history to the mass public. It brought the new social history to the masses. What is social history? Well, Inspired by the protest movements of the 1960s and 1970s, radical historians began to focus their research on various understudied groups, including African Americans, laborers, Native Americans, women, and other marginalized groups. Yet, outside of academia, even as more and more of these books were being published by historians, they were primarily read by other historians. So the general public had, for the most part, not been exposed to such stories. Rather, they still learned about the founding fathers and other elites, primarily white, wealthy males. That was what history was all about for the majority of American citizens. In other words, Zinn had brought that history from the bottom up to the masses. He had brought it to the masses. Now, additionally, I want to focus on this idea of objectivity versus advocacy history versus subjectivity. And we see this discussion in the documents for this week, but I want to tie it into this lecture, just in general, what these things mean in the mind of Howard Zinn. Now, Zinn refused. He refused to merely serve as an objective reporter of historical facts. And this is something that we've talked about a lot in this class, about what is the role of historian. Some historians, primarily the scientific historians, Aronki, for instance, was big on the idea that history is all about reporting the facts. Carr, we read the article, the chapter by Carr, talking about just the facts, please. So clearly this is a major element of this story of historiography across time. But for Zinn, that was not his thing. He did not, again, want to be an objective reporter of historical facts. Rather, as one of the readers for the publisher explained in his report for Zinn's book. So what I mean by that is when you publish something with a press, with a publishing house, what you do is you send in that book to that publisher, and that publisher will send it out to 2, 3 or so readers, basically other historians, and they will read it and they will comment on it. One of these readers who read Zinn's book before it was actually published to offer him comments and advice and so on, described Zinn's book, A People's History, as, quote, advocacy history. And by this, the reader meant that Zinn explicitly identified with the oppressed stories who he talked about in A People's History. He definitely identified with the oppressed whose stories he talked about in A People's History. He was not a unbiased reporter about what these people were doing. He was rooting them on. He was celebrating what they had done in history. So therefore, as for objectivity, Zinn believed it did not exist and that historians could not be objective. In fact, in a 1987 interview, Zinn said the following, and this is a quote that we see on the screen here about objectivity. "There's no such thing as objective history," he told the interviewer, "because history is always slanted in some way or another, and I want to be very forthright about my slant, that I want to see history from a standpoint of the people of the world who have been mostly on the underside of things." Now this gets to the notion that if history isn't objective, it is subjective, and that is what Howard Zinn was talking about. He believed that history was all about being subjective and the choosing of particular evidence. Because in fact, given the abundance of evidence from which to pick and choose, subjectivity, therefore, not objectivity, reigns supreme in the historical profession, according to Zinn. There is simply too much evidence out there, and a historian, even though you're supposed to sort of pick a wide spectrum of material, you have to only pick a certain amount. Your book can only be so long, so therefore it is subjective. So what we are seeing here, in short, is, again, to kind of wrap it all into a nice tight bowl, objectivity was bunk in the mind of Howard Zinn. There was no thing as objectivity. Therefore, we need to accept that historians subjectively choose the evidence to make their point. And in the process, they are going to choose evidence that sort of helps them tell a story that they want to tell. And this is where we get to the idea of advocacy history. They are rooting for the people in their story. They are not just an unbiased observer. They are actually rooting for the people in their story. So interestingly enough, I want to end this slide by going back to scientific history. Again, Ronke, who was big on the idea of documentation. You use the archives, you cite your information for other historians to read and check your work if there is any question about what you are arguing and the points that you are making. Well, interestingly enough, Zinn's lack of footnotes in a people's history and his decision to include just a bibliography remains a black mark for many professional historians, both back in 1980 as well as up to the day today in the 2020s. Even an acquaintance at Harper and Row, the publishing house that published A People's History, wrote to tell Zinn, quote, "Your citations were skimpy. Your citations were skimpy." So if you remember, this is actually in contrast. This is actually in contrast to what a lot of the radical historians were doing that we talked about last week in the 1960s, where you see them actually using hundreds of citations, hundreds of footnotes, to prove that the story they were telling was historically accurate. We discussed the significance of that because it, again, was used as sort of a protection, a guard against critics who would say that you radical historians are making up history. That didn't bother Howard Zinn. He was not concerned about a sort of protection of his historical stature, that he is using footnotes. But nonetheless, I wanted to bring it up because, again, it kind of distinguishes him from his predecessors who were involved with radical history. I want to finish this lecture by talking a little bit about a quote that I used on a previous screen that came from one of the readers of Howard Zinn's book before A People's History was published, and that was the idea of advocacy history. And I want to describe the activist historian that Zinn was, the activist historian, because what we are going to see is Zinn not only criticized objectivity, but in doing so, he also did not shy away from either moralism or presentism when writing about a figure like Christopher Columbus, as you saw in the reading for this week. Howard Zinn offered a contemporary moral reflection on America's long and painful history of imperialism and racism. And when we're talking about America, we're talking about sort of their European forebears as well. Obviously, before Americans became Americans, they were Europeans. So that's what I'm getting at here, that obviously Christopher Columbus is a descendant of Americans, even though he was from Europe, as other Americans were. So nonetheless, we would see Zinn repeatedly make the claim, and you see this in the document as well that you're reading for this week, that laudatory portrayals of Christopher Columbus generally signaled an acceptance of all the atrocities that were committed by him. And the reason why Howard Zinn claimed that these historians portrayed Columbus as a hero was because they believed in all the bad things that he did, he still helped progress history. All of the atrocities led to progress. And this is something, again, that we've talked about in our discussion of historiography over the years and decades, that progress was a big notion among historical writing. And it was celebrated. And this goes back to whether we're talking about the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, whether we're talking about the consensus historians who are celebrating American progress. Progress was huge in the mind and psyche of historians across time. But Howard Zinn is asking us to pause and think about at what cost? At what cost was that progress achieved? And he is saying it was not worth it. Christopher Columbus destroyed a culture and a people to create that progress, to bring about that progress. In short, what we are seeing with these criticisms of Christopher Columbus, Zinn wanted people to think critically about American history and its effect on current events rather than accept a patriotic view of the past. Therefore, what we see here is he wanted history to inspire people to speak out. But not only speak out, also to organize, to fight for injustice, fight against injustice, I should say, and to resist. And we can really see this in another interview that Howard Zinn gave in 1994, in which he said the following, quote, "I wanted to change the world, and I thought history might be helpful." This is that idea, again, of advocacy history. We are going to use the past to learn about the present and to try to understand how we can go about changing the problems that still plague society here in the present times. Such a perspective is evident in his earlier books, in Howard Zinn's earlier books, which included a 1964 book on the civil rights movement known as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the New Abolitionists, which again he was involved in down at Spelman College, and also a book written 3 years after that, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, where he is criticizing U.S. imperialism in Vietnam and obviously calling for withdrawal here in 1967. So we started this lecture, I should say, by talking about how in 2012, Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, was ranked number 2 on the list of, quote, least critical book in print. I want to end with a non-professional historian's view. And this comes from a letter that was written by a Massachusetts college student in 2001 to Howard Zinn. Here's what that letter said. It was clearly a letter of praise, as you can see by this quote. It said the following: "A People's History, quote, opened up a whole new way of viewing not only my country and its government, but also the effect my country has on the rest of the planet." This raise in consciousness raising, is essentially what this activist historian, Howard Zinn, did. He woke people up to help them understand that while many things that America did were great, they also experienced a lot of bad times, and a lot of bad things happened throughout history, and Americans needed to learn about these bad things to help them change the present as well as understand the past most fully. So that is who Howard Zinn was, and again, you see that clearly in the documents that you're reading for this week, where he tries to use history as a lesson for the present.